From the College of Business and Economics at Boise State University, this is BUSMBA 550. My name is Regis Turpin, and the content of this video is Introduction to Inventory Management. In this video, I'm going to talk about the different type of inventories. I'm going to talk about different ways we can measure inventory levels. And lastly, I'm going to introduce one technique for managing inventory. So first thing about inventory is that most people in an organization are going to have some kind of relationship with inventory, or if you like, they will be affected by inventory, even though they may not be physically connected or they don't even touch, if you like, the inventory. So let's look at sales and marketing people, for instance. Those people tend to think that inventory is a positive thing because having inventory allows them to provide immediacy to their customer. Not having inventory is one of the worst thing because it could mean that you have to turn away customer, and if you experience that as a customer, you know how unpleasant it is. So they don't want to do that. So they like having inventory. Now, in accounting, they are not necessarily connected with inventory, but they can see the monetary consequences of having too much of it. So if you look at a balance sheet, you'll find that inventory is listed in the asset section of the balance sheet. And that's because the idea is that you can sell that inventory at any time and get money out of it. So that's at least the theory, but in practice, it may prove a little more difficult than on paper. So that's one of the problem. Another of the problem from the standpoint of accounting people is that this money that is tied in inventory could be used for something that is more useful, or at least something that has a higher rate of return than inventory. In fact, inventory tends to lose its value over time. When if that money was invested somewhere else, you could get a few percent return. That would be a lot better. Now, in operations and supply chain, the way we see inventory is that we see it as a necessary evil, if you like. We like having some of it, but just enough to keep operations running smoothly. Any unit beyond that is unnecessary, and we don't like having too much of it. It's costly to manage and requires a lot of resources. Now, some companies are relying heavily on inventory. If you think of company like Amazon, they have about 50% of their invested capital in inventory. So for them, any improvement in the management of inventory can make the difference between making money or losing money. Even a fraction of a percent improvement in efficiency is a big deal for those companies. If you open an operations textbook in the chapter about inventory, you'll find that it tends to classify inventory along two different criteria. The first one is in terms of the function of inventory, and the other one is in terms of the type of item. So let's talk about function first. There are six different functions of inventory. And the first type of function is for anticipation. So let's say that you are preparing for Christmas and you are a major toy manufacturer. What you're going to do, you're going to stock item 3 to 6 months before, and just to make sure you're going to meet demand when Christmas comes. The second function of inventory is safety stock. So that means that you're going to store inventory to buffer against fluctuation in the demand. So think about a restaurant that has some safety stock just to make sure they won't run out of lettuce or vegetables or the raw material to prepare all their dishes during the day. So that would be an example of safety stock. Lot size or cycle stock inventory is about taking advantage of quantity discounts. So it's not unusual for salespeople to give you quantity discount if you buy a large amount or at least amount larger than necessary. So that would be this type of inventory. Fourth type is called pipeline or transportation inventory. And the idea behind that is simply that a unit or a box that is sitting on a truck or on a ship between China and the US is the same thing as having a box sitting in a warehouse. It is a form of inventory. Uh, Fifth type of inventory is speculative, and this one is typically used to hedge against some risk that is sometimes difficult to predict. So think about having stock in preparation of an earthquake or a war or a major strike. The US has, for instance, some strategic gasoline reserve that they keep in case of a major conflict. That's between 3 and 6 months worth of gasoline that they have ready just in case a major conflict takes place and there is a disruption in the delivery of oil and gasoline. Last type of inventory is management, repair, and operating supplies, MROs. That's a type of inventory that includes small items that are necessary to keep production running smoothly, or at least to keep operation in general in a company running smoothly. So that could include things like spare parts or lubricant for equipment, or if you are in an office, it would include office supplies. It could include like toilet paper or a lot of items of that nature. I mean, it's small item in terms of their amount, but when you combine all those items, it amounts to some significant amount. Now, what I want to show you in this slide is how inventory can sometimes be used as a strategic weapon. And what I want also to illustrate is the fact that inventory is not always a bad thing if used well. So that's based on an article that I read about how Iowa corn producers are using silos now as a strategic weapon. Back in time, the corn producers in Iowa didn't have any storage capacity. And what it meant was that after the harvest, they had to sell their crop very quickly to companies that had warehouses. And because they couldn't wait for a very long time because of the perishability of the product, they were often forced to sell it at a low price because harvest time is the time where the supply is the highest. As an illustration, in September 2011, they were selling their corn at the price of $6 per bushel. Later on, what they decided to do was to build silos and use that as a way to store their crop after the harvest and wait until the price of the harvest went higher. Typically means waiting a couple of months after harvest and selling it then. And what happened is that in 2012, thanks to that system, they were able to sell their corn at a price of 7.40 per bushel instead of $6. That's a 20% increase. So that's a good illustration of how inventory can be used as a strategic weapon. Another method to classify inventory, I mentioned that, is simply the type of material. You see that in this classification, the type of inventory varies based on the type of item. So it goes from raw material to work in process to finished goods. And then you have components and distribution inventory. And finally, you have the MROs as well in that classification. In terms of measuring inventory, there are two main methods. The first method, that is probably the most common one, is one that measures turnover. And turnover is the annual cost of goods sold divided by the average inventory value. A good way to look at inventory turn is to think of it as how many times a firm is going to flush its inventory over the period of 1 year. So in my example here, I have 26 inventory turn, and what it means is that during a period of 1 year, this company is going to flush that amount of inventory, the average amount of inventory that they have, 26 times. In other words, every 2 weeks. Now, another method of measuring inventory is simply by considering the days or weeks of supply. That may be a little more speaking to us people in operations because, for instance, having 2 weeks worth of inventory, which is equivalent to 26 inventory turn, is speaking a little more to me. When I hear I have 2 weeks left of inventory, I know that what it means. It means that I have to reorder pretty quickly, and I know how much I have on hands and how long it's going to last me. But both methods are equally good. Lastly, what I want to talk about is one method for managing inventory. This is one of the oldest method and was developed in the 1950s. It's called the ABC classification. It's a basic method that is designed to help companies that are managing thousands of items and that need to do a rough job to separate those items into categories from most important to least important. And the way this method is working is using a principle called the Pareto principle. The Pareto principle was discovered by an Italian economist called Pareto, who found out that 80% of the wealth in northern Italy was generated by 20% of the people, and vice versa. So another name of the Pareto rule is the 80-20 rule. So most of you would have heard about that rule. So we're using that rule here in a context of inventory. And essentially what it means is that you have 20% of the items in terms of count that are going to account for about 80% of the value of the items. And ABC analysis is using the same concept, but instead of having only two categories, we have three categories, so A, B, and C. So typically the A item, which are the most important item, would represent between 15 and 20% of the items in terms of number, but they would account for 70 or 80% of the value. If I go to the other extreme, which is the C items, the least important ones, they are the one that represents a large volume in terms of number of items, about 50% of the count, but they only represent 5% of the dollar value. Those are the two extreme. And in between those two items, you have the B item. So the ones that account for around 30% of the count in the number of items, but about 15% of their dollar value. Let me illustrate that with an example. So the way it works, and if you have an Excel sheet, is very easy to do. So you have on the left-hand side here the SKUs, so the list of items that are in your stock. So in this case, we have 10 items. And the information that you need for an ABC analysis is simple. All you need is the dollar volume that are going to go through your warehouse in a certain period of time, let's say 1 year. Then you're going to need also the unit cost here. And what you're going to do, you're going to multiply the annual volume by the unit cost to get an annual dollar volume. Once you have that, and in Excel it's very easy to do, you're going to sort it out from higher to lower volume. And then you're going to compute the percentage of that compared to the total. So for instance, 90,000 here represents 38.8% of the total amount of inventory. And once you're done with that, you can use it for classification. So you see that the two items at the top here, two items out of 10 items, that's 20% of the item, capture about 72% of the dollar volume. That's my A items. So that's the way it works. I'm jumping directly to the C item. If I take 50% of my items, so that's 5 SKUs out of the 10 that I had listed here. So 5 of them, that's 50%. I see that when I add up the dollar volume, it accounts to 5% exactly of the dollar volume. So that matches my criteria that I mentioned earlier. So that's going to be my C item. And finally, the B item are the one that are left in between. The idea behind this method is that you're going to classify those items based on how much dollar volume they account for. And based on that, it's going to tell you how much attention you need to pay to each item. Typically, you'll pay more attention to the A items simply because all the dollar that is involved in there, but a lot less on C items. The limitation of this method is, of course, that everything is based on dollar volume. But what if in that list you had an item that was cheap, but yet critical for your operation? Let's say a certain spare part that, for instance, if you don't have, then your whole production would shut down. So that's one of the limitation of the ABC analysis. So that's a good starting point, but typically after that, the first step is company are going to have exceptions, and they will move around some item into the A category, despite the fact that they may not be as expensive as the other item in that category. But it's fair to say that if you have thousands of items, I mean, the ABC analysis may not be the greatest, but it offers some value because at least you get a rough estimate of how much each item contributes to the total, and it's nice to have somewhere to begin.